This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys. Thank you guys. Thank you guys all for having me. I almost never made it. I was driving in here from Portland. We were out there filming a new show for the last 2 days. You guys are going to see pretty soon, coming up by November, and it's got all kinds of exciting stuff like this in it. Underground alien bases, underwater areas, lost ancient technologies, so keep an eye open for it. But before I got here, someone said to me, you know, in the great state of Oregon, he said, we have highways that are paved with rubber asphalt. And he says, your car will glide along smoothly and you'll have nothing to worry about. It will be effortless. And I thought to myself, well, that's great and all, but I'm certainly looking forward to the day when we don't have to rely on fossil fuels and tires anymore, and when we can use something like a UFO to get there a lot quicker. Exactly. Maybe some little anti-gravitics and zero-point energy would be nice. But tonight, as you know, you're here for this presentation. Were there ETs in ancient Egypt? And of course, we're going to go over that tonight. But first of all, I want to dedicate tonight's presentation to this wonderful library, the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library, and my dear friend, Jordan Peace. Can everybody please give a hand to this man for all the incredible work that he does in the world? Amazing. Amazing stuff. This is what I consider the Library of Alexandria, but with a lot of ET stuff and a couple Michael Moore books. So, just in case you're wondering who I am, this guy with a funny sounding name, a Canadian, Jonny Enoch. There's no relation to the Enoch in the Bible, although I have tried calling the publishers of the King James Bible and asking for royalties, but they're not picking up my calls. I guess their office has been out of business since 325 CE. But anyhow, for me, I'm an esoteric researcher. I love looking at the mysteries around the world. Mike's journey into this area opened up really when I was very small. When I was at least 8 years old and onwards, I was having these intense out-of-body experiences. Maybe a lot of you can relate, where all of a sudden I'd be floating above my bed looking down at myself peacefully, lying there in bed. Or sometimes I would find myself rushing up at this multicolored set of fractals, heading out into space somewhere like the Space Mountain ride over at Disneyland. And it got me asking a lot of questions, but I lived in a very religious house. I wasn't allowed to ask those kind of questions. We had an information embargo. My mom was a very charismatic Christian, so to speak. And so we had the kind of house that at the dinner table, when someone said helicopter, it got changed to heavenicopter, if you know anybody like that. And so for me, I became absolutely fascinated by getting these answers. I started hiding all these books under my bed and growing a lifelong fascination with this stuff. I became a clinical hypnotherapist so I could use these tools to go deeper into the mind. And eventually, I wanted to know, what happens after we die? Are we alone in the universe? Where do we come from? So I started traveling all over the world and crawling on my hands and knees underneath these megalithic and looking at reliefs and decoding the hieroglyphics and saying there's got to be more to all this and where we come from. But I had a very interesting experience growing up that started to lead me into this idea about extraterrestrials. This is my sister growing up, and my sister is a very interesting person. She's not interested in any of this stuff. She wouldn't be caught dead here. Okay, she doesn't like the paranormal. She doesn't like extraterrestrial talk, all that kind of stuff. To her, she's more interested in what the Kardashians are doing in Calabasas. But she has a very interesting experience that she can tell you about to this day that happened when she was 12 years old. When she was 12 years old, these gray extraterrestrials showed up at her bedroom window, just like the picture you see there, with the large teardrop eyes and the smooth dolphin-like skin, hairless, peering directly at her. And another head started to come behind that one in the window. And this absolutely stunned her. To this day, she could recall it in vivid detail, even draw what it looks like for you. And you know what's very interesting about this? Even my mom, when we talked to her about it later on, she was very reluctant. She said, the both of you guys were complaining about grave men coming into your bedrooms at night. And she said, yeah, there was activity in the backyard for a while, but I prayed it away. And I don't know what that is, but at the same time, it set me on a mission trying to find out more answers. And you know, when we look for these answers around the world, I don't think there's any civilization in the world, the cradle of civilization, in fact, that intrigues us more than Egypt. Egypt is truly fascinating. It is something that captures our imaginations in every way. If I ask you all about Egypt, what comes to mind? What's the first thing you think of? Pyramids. Hieroglyphics? Yeah, scarabs, sphinxes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Lots of things come to mind. I want to open up tonight with this passageway. And this is from one of my great heroes, the great esoteric historian Manly Palmer Hall, who gave us so much great information out of his little center, the Philosophical Research Center in Los Feliz, California. He wrote over 150 books, gave over 8,000 lectures extemporaneously without a single mistake, just and gave us countless articles. This is what he said about Egypt. He said, supreme among the wonders of antiquity, unrivaled by the achievements of later architects and builders, the Great Pyramid of Giza bears mute witness to an unknown civilization, which having completed its predestined span, passed into oblivion, eloquent in its silence, inspiring in its majesty, divine in its simplicity. The Great Pyramid is indeed a sermon in stone. Its magnitude overwhelms the puny sensibilities of man. Among the shifting sands of time, it stands as a fitting emblem of eternity itself. Who were the illumined mathematicians who planned its parts and dimensions? The master craftsmen who supervised its construction? The skilled artisans who trued its blocks of stone? It is a rather magnificent edifice. And as Manly Palmer Hall said, it is a sermon in the stone. There's nothing like it in the world. We have other pyramids. Don't get me wrong, there's pyramids everywhere, and we're going to discuss the hell out of those tonight. But that one is very unique. Okay, so what did the Egyptians possess? What did they possess that was so unique? They possessed a type of knowledge. And we often hear this term occult. And sometimes people associate the term occult with something evil because we think of cults and school buses and on little properties where people are telling us in song to give up all our worldly possessions and join them. But actually the word occult just means hidden or clandestine. It's a type of hidden knowledge. And in fact, if you go back to 2nd century Rome, we have depictions of Kronos or Saturn with rings around him. Now, how did they know that? Well, we don't get this guy, Galileo Galilei, showing up to about 1610 from his little observatory in Civitavecchia, where he gave us the telescope. Yet, somehow, those out there who were in the know, the great philosophers, the great minds, they knew that in these statues that people were bowing before, there were the great personification of hidden truths. This is a contemporary of our friend Galileo. This is Giordano Bruno. He said this in the 16th century. Innumerable suns exist. Innumerable Earths revolve around these suns in a manner similar to the way the 7 planets revolve around our sun. Living beings inhabit these worlds. Okay, so not only did he know what our scientists are just confirming now after the Kepler space mission and everything else, but he knew there was beings on these other planets. You know what they did? They said, kill him. They burned him. Okay, so that's been going on a long time. You know, telling the truth can be very dangerous sometimes. And now, what we're confirming now, we're just getting this kind of science now, what Giordano Bruno was trying to tell us so long ago. Astronomers at the University of Auckland estimate 100 billion habitable Earth-like planets in the Milky Way, 50 sextillion in the universe. That's billion with a B, ladies and gentlemen. That's more Earth-like planets than there are grains of sands on all our beaches. The former number we had for that was only 40 billion. We got that from the Kepler space mission. This number has been growing exponentially, and that's just in the visible universe. We have an incredible, vast universe full of life. The ancient Egyptians knew this. When you see Mute and you see the depictions here, what you're seeing is the Milky Way galaxy. You're seeing star systems, and you're actually seeing ships going between star systems and soul groups coming here from those star systems. You're seeing all sorts of interesting depictions. When you go to Hathor's temple in Dendara at the back, this lady knows she's been there. I see her nodding her head. This particular depiction is of our zodiac that was preserved by Ptolemy. They only have a replica there today, and the Egyptians aren't very happy about it, but if you want to see the real one, you have to go to the Louvre in Paris. But they knew all about our celestial mechanics. They were very well informed about this.
That was 13 signs.
Very good. Man, you know your stuff too. Everybody's been doing their homework around here. I like it. Does anybody know who this man is? Very good. Everybody knows their history. If I asked you, where do you think he spent all his money, what would you say? Go ahead. If you said, yeah, well, that's a good guess. If you said war, if you said, cars, women, alcohol, all those things, I won't be upset if you guess those things. Okay? But actually, where he spent all his money is in Egypt. A lot of people don't know this. When you go back to May 14th, 1964, there was a great meeting with President Nasser and Nikita Khrushchev, and they were celebrating this wonderful accomplishment they had called the Aswan High Dam. Okay? To this day, you go there. I was just there and saw it most recently again. They have the depiction. It's the Soviet, friendship, partnership monument they have there. But if you think the Soviets gave a damn about the Egyptians, sorry about the pun, that would be the inside joke there. They were there for the same reason that Napoleon went out to these places. The same reason that Hitler went out to these places. They were looking for lost high technology. And believe me, they found it. What they found when they were there is they found what they mentioned in the classified documents as the visitor. Okay? Now, I've had several conversations with people off the record about this. Archaeologists, Egyptologists, people in very informed places. That when they went down into this particular place, several archaeologists were asked to go down. There was a darkened cave. They walked down into it. And I'm told to tell you guys that anything you see on the internet about this, all the pictures are fake. There is no legitimate pictures on the internet about this. Oh. Okay, I'm supposed to move to the other side of this tomb here. Okay. So, what I'm told to tell you guys is that all the pictures online are fake of this. They went down into there. It was real and it was legitimate. And what they found when they uncovered this was a 9-foot tall remains of a body that was preserved, that had breathing masks, advanced apparatuses out of it, and it looked like scuba gear. Totally crazy. And this wasn't the first one they found. They found several of them. There's stuff that if you really knew what they found in Egypt, it would blow your mind. You probably wouldn't sleep well at night. And I'm going to reveal a few of those things to you today, so it might interrupt your sleep tonight. But legitimately, there has been all kinds of discoveries made that are actually pretty incredible. 4,000 years later, and we're back to the same language. Okay, so hieroglyphics are quite amazing, actually, when you study them. You start to pick them up after a while. I'm lucky because my friend Mohamed Ibrahim, that I do a lot of tours with, he's a leading expert in hieroglyphics, so I've had a good teacher. But when you read them, depending on the direction the hieroglyphics are faced in, that's where you want to read them. They're omnidirectional. We can kind of look them as a master key for our languages. They're very interesting. And there's 3 or 4 different ways to read them. They even had a shorthand way of reading it. And depending on which dynastic people that you're reading it from, they had better ways of making them or creating them. They're absolutely fascinating. There was even a hidden or secret way of reading them that sort of unlocked other kinds of meanings. But you know what's really interesting about hieroglyphics is that when you go back to the oldest and most ancient of stuff, the most impressive of stuff, the stuff that's made of granite, the inside of the Great Pyramid, the Osirian outside of Abydos. There's no hieroglyphics whatsoever. The most impressive stuff that we cannot even think of how it was made. And some people have put forth the idea that perhaps that's because that civilization, whoever they were, used telepathy. Now, this is a good example of how Egypt has affected us today. We're going to talk a little bit about religion today, so I hope I don't offend anybody today. I'm a great lover of all religions, and I appreciate them as a student of comparative religion. But how often do we say, what hour are you going to meet me in? Well, that comes from the Egyptian sun god Horus. That's why we have hours or Horuses in the day, the 12 steps of Horus. Or you say the sun is rising on the Horus has risen, the horizon. So Egypt is still affecting us today, very much so. It's affected a lot of our religious ideas as well. Every time you drink at Starbucks, look at the goddess on the side of your Starbucks cups. That's Isis or Pisces, you're getting it. And notice a lot of the Egyptian gods which have inspired our angel iconography. Angel, by the way, comes from the Greek angelos, meaning messenger. Notice they have wings, which sort of denotes that we're talking about someone that came from up there. Okay? We're going to get into that a little bit tonight. When you go to the Oscars, we see that Egypt has inspired the Oscars. We have Osiris. We have Ptah, the great progenitor god of Egypt. Now, does anybody know what these are? Okay. Oh, I see you naming them. Okay, we have Taj Mahal, Petra in Jordan. What's that? Very good. Machu Picchu. And? Okay. Now, this is neat. These are great monuments, but really, they're nothing compared to the ones from antiquity. They mean absolutely nothing. Somebody just said, okay, these are some great-looking stone thingies that are left over from the old world, and let's put them up. The real 7 ancient wonders in the world, by the masters of antiquity, all gave them purpose. They all had meaning. We had the Colossus of Rhodes, symbolizing the sun. These were all associated with the planetary bodies. We had the Hanging Guards of Babylon, representing Venus. The Great Pyramid in Egypt of Giza was Mercury. The Lighthouse of Pharos from Alexandria was Saturn. The Mausoleum of Halicarnassus was Mars. You had the Temple of Olympian Zeus, which was Jupiter. And the Temple of Artemis, which was one of the most beautiful of all in the ancient world, represented the moon, or Artemis. And that's located over in Ephesus in Turkey, near Kushadasi. Now, why I'm pointing this out to you is that the only one of these standing that's left from the ancient world that the masters of antiquity had left was the Great Pyramid. This incredible monument still stands today. And a lot of people don't know this about it. A lot of people, when they look at it, don't realize how many sides are to the pyramid. Did you know on the solstices, when you look at it, that there's multiple indentations that we find there? So we see 2 times 4 is 8, and we have a side on the bottom, so we actually have 9 sides to the pyramid. That's very significant to the mysteries. You have 9 tail feathers on the bird that you find in the American $1 bill. You actually find the pyramid on the American $1 bill, and it's connected with Stonehenge on it. And actually, because these are both connected, Stonehenge and the pyramid are connected with the masculine and the feminine. That's why in most American bathrooms, you'll find the triangle and the circle. They'll go back and forth. The 9 sides is also connected over to the Order of Knights Templars. The Knights Templar Order was founded by 9 Knights Templars. The number 9 you're going to find all throughout the mysteries, and it's very significant. This man was very inspired by it. The founder of the Jehovah's Witness Church. Everybody loves those guys when they're on the corner handing you some of their literature. For him, he was absolutely obsessed with Egypt. In fact, he put this on his literature, the Egyptian sun disk. Okay? Right in the cemetery where he's buried over in Pittsburgh, there's the Templar cross of Lorraine, and what we see is the Great Pyramid, which is very interesting. In fact, you know what? He was so obsessed with Egypt and also involved with Templar masonry is that when you get the watchtower, that's the Templar watchtower from the Chateau Lorraine in southern France that the Templars hid out on. But what's fascinating about this man is that he based all of their church doctrines on the Great Pyramid. If you ever walk up to a Jehovah's Witness, they'll tell you that Jesus is becoming king, and they were having this prediction of returning in 1914. Well, he figured that going back to the Hyksos period with the Hebrews, that they had built the Great Pyramid, and down into the king's chamber and below the Queen's chamber, there's the subterranean chambers, and there was a secret message, he believed, that was encoded that he traced back to 1914. It's too bad for him that because he believed that this theory was given to him by Jehovah, the next guy that was Jehosen by Jehovah, Judge Rutherford, came in there and said, all your theories are garbage, and he threw them all out and said the pyramid is from the devil. But they still used the 1914 thing. That guy brought about the only 144,000 people get saved and go to heaven idea, but little does he know that that goes back to the number 9 we were talking about. Because in Gematria, 1 + 4 + 4 = 9. You spend 9 months in the womb, everyone gets saved. But it all goes back to ancient Egypt. So a lot of people have been very fascinated by this place. In 1798, Napoleon comes to Egypt. Okay, do you know what happened to him there? He did a lot of good for Egypt, actually. He brought these savants with him, these psychic-like people that were drawing and making illustrations. Okay, and when they did this, he started restoring things and figuring out where they went. And, you know, he did help himself to a lot of the antiquities and bring them back to Paris. But he had a very interesting experience in the Great Pyramid, which starts to get us asking questions about what it's really used for. When he entered the Great Pyramid, he walked into it, usurped it, and all of a sudden, he was transported out of his body, out into the universe. He came out white as a ghost because he saw his Waterloo. And you know, a lot of the people I've taken into the Great Pyramid, when we have private access, they come out with a similar experience, where when they go up into the king's chamber, they said they became lightheaded, and all of a sudden they had an out-of-body experience, so they went somewhere. That's why I think we're dealing with something that's beyond the explanations we've been told. Told it's a tomb for Khufu or some sort of primitive stone device that they put together. Nonsense. I think how these work is through a very ancient type of energy. According to a woman in the 19th century that we go back into, a very brave woman named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, she talked about a type of energy in the universe called Fohat, and she said it moved like a serpent, like this. And actually, she said this energy was all over the place, and they understood it in the ancient world. And we find this idea all throughout our mysteries. Everywhere we look, through all these great cultures, many of them that you guys were just naming a moment ago. You know, when you go all over the world, we find connections to serpents. We find it over in the Yucatan with Kukulkan. Chichen Itza. You find it with Quetzalcoatl there. You find it with Teotihuacan. You find it over in Tikal in Guatemala, where we also find pyramids and serpents. In Peru, we find Amaru, where America gets her name. Amaruca, land of the plumed serpent. We find Viracocha there. We find it over in Egypt. We find it over in all these sorts of places, and it's telling us something, that there is a hidden technology here. There's 3 types of this serpentine energy. One of them, I bet a lot of you are familiar with, and it's called Kundalini. Okay? That's the energy that moves up through you, and it moves through the body. We also have a type of geomagnetic energy. Have any of you ever heard of ley lines, vortices, things like that?
They're all over England.
Absolutely. Absolutely, they've been well documented. Then we have a type of energy that's understood called scalar energy that Nikola Tesla was experimenting with. And that's really interesting stuff. The Germans understood this too. They had Vril, the Vril Society. They were talking about this. Or we call it zero-point energy. It's a type of universal energy. Okay? We had a certain class of folks in the ancient world that understood how to use this. And we called them the serpent rulers. In Egypt, if you look over here, you're going to notice that we see these winged serpent rulers that understood these serpentine mysteries. In fact, in the Bible, they're called the seraphim, the winged serpent gods. And if you ever look over here, you'll see this caduceus symbol on the sides of your ambulance. It's just like the staff of Hermes, Mercurius Trismegistus. And it's very much associated with what we see in the ancient rites of Freemasonry. You have the 33 vertebrae of the spine. And it's moving up the spine with the Kundalini energy, and then it opens up into both hemispheres of the brain with the swan wings, and you get the pineal opening up. That's why on the king that you see over here, when we go over look at the nimbus of the king, we see that the serpent is coming out of the forehead in the pineal gland, that it's being awakened. We go back further into the ancient world, we find out that the Druids were worshiping a god called Hu, and that's why You are humans. Okay? That's why St. Patrick was chasing the serpents out of Ireland. These serpentine energies were found all around the planet. Even in the Bible, it says that the tribe of Dan was following the path of the serpent. It says that in the book of Genesis. And we know that there are certain places on our planet that have tremendous energy. Look at the 33rd parallel, look at Glastonbury Tor, look at the Great Pyramid, look at these places with great geomagnetic anomalies. They're very interesting. This is a man that maybe some of you can recognize, the great Walt Disney. Before Walt Disney opened up that wonderful magical place we call Disneyland at 1313 South Harbor Boulevard in Anaheim, California. And I know the address because I go there a lot. I like the place. But he opened Disneyland on July 17th, 1955. But before he did, he made some incredible things happen for Disneyland. He was a beautiful man, an amazing man. He was fascinated by the Rosicrucian mysteries. He was fascinated by all these wonderful subjects that you guys are all into. But he consulted these guys, Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood and Buzz Price. Now, do you remember in Toy Story, Buzz and Woody? That's who they are. That's who it's based off of. They were taken out of Disney history for a while, but this was covered in Walter Bosley's book, Keys to the Kingdom, which I urge you all to get. Unless it's in the back there, then just take it out of the library. But anyhow, when they were putting Disneyland together, these guys were from Stanford Research Institute. Okay, so if you know about that with Hal Puthoff and Pat Price and the likes of all the remote viewing stuff, have you ever seen that movie with George Clooney called Men Who Stare at Goats, where they're doing remote viewing? Well, these guys were hanging out in that crew. That was their thing. When they built Disneyland, they put it on the 33rd parallel for the energy. And there's other parks that they did that with, actually. And when they put it on the 33rd parallel, what they did is they put the carousel behind the castle to act as a Tesla coil to spin the energy out into the park. The carousel was moved slightly to offset the energetic balance. But it's actually quite fascinating the way that Disneyland was put together. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, this is on one of the road trips with my friend Jordan Maxwell, and he's a very incredible researcher, and I'll get to him in a second. But that's my sister in the back, and I'm pointing out she's wearing headphones because here we are driving out to Area 51. We're talking about all the aliens, cool things in the universe, and she's listening to Justin Bieber. Okay, she says, I don't want to hear any of this crap that you guys are talking. I flew her out so that when she came out, she would be able to help us take some videos and stuff like that. Now, Jordan, if you don't know his story, he's an expert in symbols, secret societies, and ancient religions. But when I asked him, I said, Jordan, what got you into religion? And he said, well, actually, he says, I have to thank my wife. He said, my wife introduced me to religion. He said, before her, I didn't know what hell was. But anyways. But anyhow, when we've been on our road trips, we go to all kinds of interesting places. One of the places we went to is this interesting little place that a lot of people are now talking about. We went out to Rachel, Nevada. If you've ever been there, anyone ever been to Area 51 here? Okay, well, awesome. Just don't follow the people on Facebook right now that are wanting to go there. This doesn't sound doesn't sound like a good idea, right, Jordan? Oh, well, there you go. Well, when I've been there, a lot of interesting things I've learned, a lot over the years from Jordan and folks like that. Behind me is this place called S4, Groom Lake, Area 51. We heard a lot about it from Lazar and John Lear, Gene Huff, all those guys that came out talking about that. And we're going to get to Bob Lazar in a bit, so I won't talk about him a lot yet, but he's how we found out about it. A lot of people don't know, the facts about this place. It's really interesting. It has kind of an occult history to it. It's on the 33rd parallel. That's why I got it after the Disney slide. I had to slide it in there. But actually, before it got started, Jack Parsons was involved. JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratories. They were doing sex magic stuff there. All kinds of stuff with Ron L. Hubbard, our buddy from Scientology. This was a very interesting place. It's all underground. So even if you storm in, you're not going to see anything. You have to go in further. But a lot of people ask the question, they say, well, if there's Area 51, how come there's no Area 52 and Area 53? Where the hell does Area 51 come from? Well, that's a very interesting explanation because one of the guys that worked there was in nearby at the little cafe and one day, and he was saying, well, He says Area 51 gets its name from Mayday. And Mayday is a distress signal. That's what you say when you're in trouble, right? That's 0501. Well, 0501 is also the founding of the Bavarian Illuminati by Adam Weishaupt. 0501, 1776. This is very interesting. There's a great little cafe near called the Little Alien Inn nearby that has great pie and coffee, by the way. And I love a good pie, but I hear the refreshments here are much better. So that's the thing. It is closer. I got to tell you, yeah, that's the thing. It really beats having to drive all the way there. But anyhow, over here at the Little Alien Inn, they have a picture of all the famous people and interesting folks that have come there over the years and their experiences they've had at this incredible place, all the talks. There's Jordan's picture, and Jordan always wants me to point out that his picture is the biggest picture on the wall. No, seriously, he told me to put that in there. But anyways, Jordan had a very interesting experience there, actually with his friend Paul Tice from Book Tree Publishing and their friend Ivy White, and they're being interviewed here by the late Anthony Hilder, who we lost recently. And Jordan had an experience where when they arrived out there to Area 51, they were driving along and all of a sudden a large UFO enveloped the sky and started to follow them. He said it was frightening, scared him at the core. And they all came back and they were shaken up and they were staying in the little rooms over by Little Alien Inn, and in the middle of the night, a gray extraterrestrial came into their room, just like the movie Paul, which is a brilliant movie if you haven't seen it. But it's interesting that when you go outside of this place, there is an eerie feeling. You see a lot of interesting stuff at night. Sometimes they have these kind of war games. If you hit it lucky at the right time of the year, you can see them practicing with all kinds of things out there, all kinds of craft in the sky, which is a very interesting part about this story. But Jordan used to tell me all the time, he said, you know what we got to do? He says, if you really want to find out what's going on at Area 51, you just have to cross the road. Okay? And there's not a lot of action on this road. You can literally lay on it. There's like hardly any cars on it at all. So when you cross the road at by Area 51 and all these places, little telephone poles over here, he used to say to me, put your ear up to the pole and listen. Tell me what you hear. And I'd hear this rustling and bustling underground, like these tracks. He said, that's right, you're hearing the train system. There's a train system, and they connect all these underground bases together. From Dulce, Los Alamos, and onward, they keep going forward. I think someone's getting a message here about Area 51. Getting excited. But anyways, it's all good. This is an idea of what we'd look at if we were looking at Cappadocia. Okay? For places like Turkey and other places in the world, we know that this idea of having underground bases is not a new idea. Okay? Lots of civilizations have had underground bases. In fact, in the ancient world, we can go back to the Oracle of Delphi, where the Hydra would come up from the ground and consult them. Under Angkor Wat Temple in Cambodia, we have the Naga Serpent, which comes up. We have over here again Cappadocia. We have the underground tunnels the Templars used. We have Agartha, which the Germans talked about, a giant underground civilization that had been there since antediluvian times. We had Shambhala to the Asians, and now we drill them with these DUMBs, deep underground military bases, they're called. And Egypt is included on this list. I don't know if any of you guys who have been to Egypt have had the opportunity to go down what's known as the Osiris shafts, which is very cool. You need a special permission to do it. Come with me and I'll get you in. But underneath there, it's kind of creepy because you find, as you're stepping down there, you go way underneath there because the Giza plateau is all artificially leveled, by the way, which is really cool. It's got lots of underground passageways and water channels. When you're down there, you start stepping on bones, like human bones and remains, and it goes down even deeper. And it's very, very interesting how far that goes. But our civilizations all seem to tap in to these underground networks, which are everywhere. But you might be asking yourself, how is this possible that our planet has these underground networks? Where do they come from? Well, you have to understand how rocky planets are formed. Do you remember earlier I was telling you about Fohat, the serpentine energy that exists in our universe that goes like this? Well, you might say what our science tells us instead about that movement of energy, that when we see the formation of rocky planets, we see the embryonic mass that gathers from the plasma of stars. And then there's a pushing and pulling thanks to centripetal and centrifugal forces. And due to radioactive decay and friction, we start to see the gathering of moisture in these layers. So that's why you start to see it starts to form like a honeycomb. of an inside area of these underground networks. All of our rocky planets are sort of built in with these underground bases. But at the same time, this is why there's more water inside the Earth than there is on the surface. So as we speak, there's a pressure building in something called the underwater mantle. I know this guy knows it. He gave me the nod. So when we look at this, what might be happening with underground bases, when we look at this, what might be happening around the world, we get some clues. Have any of you guys ever flown into Denver? You've seen this mural at the airport? Well, they had to make it because after a while people were talking about it. There's an underground base and we have a very interesting, almost apocalyptic like scenery over there. When I first saw it, I was like, wow, what are we looking at here? This is incredible. Well, we know that these bases and places were utilized for a reason. We look at some point on this planet we had ancient cataclysms. Okay, a lot of people have talked about this recently. Graham Hancock did a whole book on this with his Magician of the Gods. People have talked about around 12,800 years ago. We think that maybe we had a number of things happen on our planet. Some think it was an asteroid that hit. We call it the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. Some think we've had solar storms. Some think we've had earthquakes, or all of the above. You know, the S hit the fan, so to speak, around there. And we entered a period from what we call the Pleistocene period up until now, which we call the Holocene, so after the Ice Age. So after this period, the surface of the Earth wasn't a very nice place to live. A lot of folks had to go underground. They had to live into these particular areas and change. Yes?
Hasn't Andrew Collins done a lot of research regarding this topic as well, about these underground civilizations?
Yes. I think a lot of people should be too. I think everybody should be researching this.
Large individuals as well.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely,
These stones were rather tall.
absolutely. You know, that's it. There's been some very big areas that get covered into these spans of these underground areas. In fact, one thing you might be asking yourself, if you look up at places like Lake Titicaca in Peru, when you go up Lake Titicaca, it's 12,000 feet above sea level. Why are there fossilized seashells up there? You know, how the hell did they get around there so fast building these walls around the place? We got to start asking ourselves questions like that. The Andes are relatively new mountains. Machu Picchu is a trip. You look at it, it looks like someone chopped it right in half. We got all kinds of crazy stuff going on up there. That's right.
It refers to the underground tunnels as a place where people went during one such cataclysm.
Absolutely.
And,
Did you read Jay Widener's book on that?
oh yes.
That's what I figured.
That's where I learned.
Yeah, that's a great work. We see this over here, that all sorts of ancient civilizations have known about these. In fact, even in our modern world, we have little clues that we've had cataclysms and warning us and giving us little breadcrumbs and helping us out. The Mayan calendar, maybe they got it backwards. Maybe instead of 2012, it was 2021. Okay, if you ever heard of the Georgia Guidestone, according to my contacts, it's high-level Masonic. But this is the thing with it. I want to say it's not this bad eugenics monument that people think it is. People think that it's talking about taking down the world's population. We see the number 500,000, people freak. You look at it from another perspective. It has 8 different languages. It's a clock and a calendar and has repopulation directions for if something goes wrong in the world. And these were around since ancient times. Pillars of Enoch, the antediluvian pillars. If you drive to Nevada, which isn't too far from here, you'll see at the Hoover Dam. Anyone ever been to the Hoover Dam? You ever seen these occult statues of the angels? Did you ever look behind it and see the procession of the equinox calendar showing the cycles, the cyclic aspects that we're moving out of a cycle? Okay, so maybe we got into this position because we were abusing certain types of ancient technology. Okay, I'm here to tell you that I believe the pyramid that we were discussing is a type of technology. According to Chris Dunn, he's given us what we call the Giza power plant hypotheses, where he said that the ancient pyramid works like a Faraday cage. We have granite, we have limestone, we have sandstone. Okay, does anybody know what granite is made out of? Okay, very good, but silica, like silicone microchips, where we get piezoelectrical energy, which we get from quartz crystal, right? We use it with microchips. It's an energy conductor and insulator. So that gives you a little clue when you start seeing rose granite basins when we go up into granite. Well, granite is found on everything. These obelisks are like acupuncture points on the planet, acupuncture needles. If you're in Karnak in Egypt, you see one of these lying on the side, and you just happen to tap it on the side, it will resonate a sound. It resonates a vibration. They hold energy, and they're like repeaters. We find pyramids all over the world, ladies and gentlemen. You know, as we were talking about, there's pyramids on both sides of the Atlantic. There's 140 pyramids over by the Marian Islands, the giant one underground off the west coast of Cuba. We find a very large one in China, one in St. Louis. We find them all over the world, underground ones in many different places. Is it possible that these civilizations were experimenting with a type of geomagnetic energy and gravity in a way that we experiment with HAARP? Were they using atmospheric changes? Were they going through this? All of these have one thing in common. They were raised in a place in Egypt called On, and On is very important in Freemasonry. It's why you turn the lights on. It's why when your Bible was translated for the name Sol, Om, On, it's the three names for the light. Sol is the Latin for the light, Om is the Hindu for the light, and On is the Egyptian for the light. But that place was called Heliopolis to the Greeks. That's why you have Neon, the new light. These all came from there, and they were raised by a guy named Thutmose III, who is very important. And the Masters of Enlightenment said, hey, we have to put these in our cities. So if you go to London and Westminster, we have Cleopatra's Needle, named after the Ptolemaic queen, Cleopatra VII. We have it over in Paris, Para-Isis, the city of light. We have it in New York. That's also important too, by the way, because York used to be ruled from, York is where England was ruled from Rome, and New York is where America was ruled by England. So all these have a very significant purpose to them. And right there in Westminster, we also have Big Ben, which is modeled with the Ben stone. It is an obelisk in its design. So is the Eiffel Tower next to the Seine River with its 22 bridges. But where do we get the story of a civilization that went haywire, that went crazy, that was experimenting like this? Well, we hear it from Atlantis. In the story of Atlantis, you know, we think, hey, that's a Greek story because we think of Plato. But point in fact, it is an Egyptian story. We get it from the Critias and Timaeus. Plato heard the story from his uncle Critias, that heard it from his great-great-grandfather Solon, who traveled to Egypt when it was called Sais, and met with a high priest named Sanchis. And when he met with Sanchis, he came in there with all this knowledge. He says, I'm Plato, I got this great story. I know what happened to the world, the flood story. Or I'm Solon, sorry, I got this story. Sure hope he didn't think he was Plato. But anyways, he came there, and when he talked to him, he said, silly, silly Solon, calm down. You Greeks are like children to us. There's been, you know, one flood story that you think you knew of. You know, the Chinese had a flood story. And the Hindu stories, they had a flood story about 12,000 years ago. But he said, there's been many, many civilizations on this earth. They've been wiped out by fire. They've been wiped out by water, all sorts of cataclysms. But there was one last civilization that he told them about. And this story was recorded in a temple called Nefru, which has since been wiped away. And he said this great civilization was known as Atlantis, which we don't find any other Egyptian words like it. We can go back and we can also find the word Atlas, which is very interesting. And he said that they rose to great power, but they had become corrupted, and they had fallen apart over time. Now, when you're in Egypt, you can go off the area of the Aswan, and you can go visit a temple called Edfu. Edfu is a very interesting place. You see a temple of Horus. If you go to the outside of it, we see that clearly it had some sort of a design that looks like, first of all, it was built for giants, which I very much believe it was, by the way. I believe it was a pre-cataclysmic site that the dynastic Egyptians took it over and they threw a bunch of writing on it. So just like we were talking about those antediluvian pillars that they don't want to forget their history, they wanted to have a little history lesson. Well, when I've been there with my friend Mohamed, as I mentioned to you guys, he is a leading expert in hieroglyphics. We've gone out there and we've examined the story of Atlantis that can be found in Edfu, which we believe is a copy of the one that would have been in Nefru. We see over there a very interesting story because in the depictions, which you don't see here, we see here the seafaring gods that came to repopulate with civilization. What you see is what they claim took out this great civilization was a serpent that came from the sky. Now, some believe that was an asteroid, but I'd ask, could it be electromagnetic energy? Because we know the serpent always represented energy. We have a very different idea of what the Earth could have looked like. You know, if we go back 50,000 years, the Earth would have been much smaller. Our ancestors had it a lot easier on this planet. You know, a lot of people have different theories about where they think Atlantis was. Some think now it's in the Eye of Africa, Mauritania. They think maybe it's in the Azores and Canary Islands, out in the middle of the Atlantic ridge. That could have been the central hub of Atlantis, where those would have been the mountain peaks, and they would have, you know, spread out into Europe at certain times, with the Pillars of Hercules being the Rock of Gibraltar. I think that we're thinking too small. I believe Atlantis was a global dissemination of culture. If the Egyptians are telling us about this being their predecessors, I believe these are the guys that gave us pyramids. We find pyramids all over the world, and I think they're very significant. We know at some time ago on the Earth there was higher oxygen levels and less gravity. That's why if you were to bring the dinosaurs back today, they wouldn't survive, because it's not really idealistic conditions. But look at all the different types of civilization that has changed. You know, we get this idea when we go back from Pangea, and we have the different stages that we go in the Triassic to Jurassic period, and everything that's changed over. It says even in the Bible, it says right there in the book of Genesis, in the days of Peleg, the continents were divided, it says. Now, the reason I'm quoting the Bible for you guys, which the book of Genesis is really based on the Sumerian and English. If we go back into the 4th and 6th centuries BCE, they're writing about hundreds of thousands of years of history and condensing it into symbolism there. We have some reference points to go by, which is very interesting. And this gives us a good idea when we look at Egypt. When you look at Egypt, you have to look at it like layers of an onion, because everybody wants to say, Egypt is mine. That's my Egypt. Everybody's fighting over Egypt. You see guys on the news all the time saying, no, Egypt was my people. No, Egypt was my people. Egypt was all of our people at one point. If you look at Egypt like the layers of the onion, what do you see today? You see the Arabic or Islamic layer. If you peel back that layer, you're going to go back. And you're going to go back, let's say, to a Jewish layer. Then you're going to go back to a Coptic Christian. And then you're going to go back to a Roman layer. And if you go back past the Roman layer, you're going to get over to the Greek layer with a friend of ours named Alexander the Great Macedonian conqueror that came in with the Ptolemaic kings. Before that, you had a Persian layer. And before the Persian layer, we go back to the dynastic Egyptians. And that dynastic Egyptians is another puzzle, because we have Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, and we start splitting it out into the Hyksos people and everything else like that. But before the dynastic Egyptians, we go back into the pre-dynastic Egyptians, who are really primitive, that start crawling up from the ground and banging sticks together, trying to figure out what the hell they just found after the cataclysms. But where you're going to find your real prize is in the pre-cataclysmic Egyptians. When you start asking who were the pre-cataclysmic Egyptians, that's the stuff that's really going to get you thinking. Remember, we were talking about the idea that there's been cataclysms on the earth? We're told, especially when we look at guys like Velikovsky and everyone else that's looked at our earth and our history, that when these cataclysms took place, our earth shifted 23.5 degrees. When Brien Foerster and I have been in Egypt, and he and I are doing a tour coming up here over in Peru this November, and Bolivia. When we've been there, he said, Johnny, come here, I want to show you something. If you go into the temples over to Karnak and places like that, you see the old entrances of the pre-cataclysmic areas. Of the oldest entrances that we see are 23.5 degrees off from the cardinal directions of northeast, southwest, compared to the rest of the temple, which we know that they built in those proportions, which is very interesting. Here's a quote for you guys. The Egyptians were strangers who, in remote times, settled on the banks of the Nile, bringing with them the civilization of their mother country, Atlantis, we think, the art of writing and a polished language. They had come from the direction of the setting sun, or the far west, when you go across the Sahara. That takes us out even to the Atlantic, if you want to put it there, and were the most ancient of men. That came from Diordas of Sicily in 50 BCE. Okay? And actually, here's an idea for you guys if we're talking about how many different civilizations that have been involved with Egypt. This is in Kambombo Temple. We see this is 42 different tribes all lined up here. So we had at least 42 different tribes represented in Egypt at different times, leading out into the dynastic times, including the people that we call the Hebrews that came there. This is a very interesting topic, because then we start talking about the Hyksos people and everything else like that. Now, it's very interesting, when you talk to many rabbis, they actually believe that the Hebrew people came from a planet and have an extraterrestrial origin. The planet is called Hebra. And notice the Ra at the end. And they link that over to the Talmud and the Torah, which is very interesting. We also find from scholars they believe that we have a Vedantic connection to ancient India with this. When the story in the Bible that talks about Abraham and Sarah, we link it over to Abraham equaling Brahman or Brahma, and Sarah being like the Saraswati River over in India. And many people will say, well, this Kabbalah that is taught perhaps has a connection to a mystical, otherworldly connection. We also find a connection to today's Israel over with this particular idea. From the name we get from the Egyptian gods. Israel is Isis, Ra, and El. Okay? And this is very interesting because when you look at where Jerusalem is, it's located in the center of a giant landmass visible from space. And you notice that everybody's always fighting over this piece of land. They want that particular center piece of land. What's very interesting for you to consider too is that all languages east of Jerusalem are written right to left. All languages west of Jerusalem are written left to right. And we actually have gigantic megalithic structures that far predate that place today that are sitting under their walls and megaton blocks, things that are absolutely incredible. And Brien Foerster's going there very shortly to analyze them. And from our ancient writings, we find all sorts of references to the gods that seeded these civilizations. When we're over in the British Museum and these other places, we find the Assyrians and the Akkadians. And we find that in the background, they're being instructed by winged gods. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment about why that's important, because we see over in the Sumerian kings list that it says here, the flood swept over the land. After the flood had swept over the land, kingship had descended from heaven for a second time. So, you know, our overseers had to step in and give us a helping hand when things got a little crazy. Again, remember, we have these depictions of Isis having these wings and helping us. But what's very interesting, you see in this depiction over here, you notice that, I don't know if you can see it, but they're holding a bag. Do you see that? How there's a bag there and they have something in their hand right here. Have you ever seen that on the internet? We call it men with bags. Okay? Well, if you ever see that, people have all kinds of different theories. They say, well, maybe what's in the bags, they were holding psychedelic drugs. Or maybe it was a sort of a generator device and they had some kind of taser with them, and that's what they were doing. Point in fact, if you talk to anthropologists, and I've talked to a few, including at the British Museum, they'll tell you that that's a bag of pollen, that they were the great pollinators, and that what's in their hand is a date palm date. And that's very significant because if you go to places like Paracas in Peru, Brien Foerster will tell you the Inca don't know what they're doing with all the date palms there, and they come from other places, but someone put them there in the area where all the elongated skulls are. Furthermore, we look back into the ancient world, many of the kings and people that we see were called the beekeepers. You notice how that looks like he's sort of like a bee in the background? It's also like a nimbus, which you find that's also like the auric bodies that are being enhanced when we look over at Tutankhamun's mask. But also the Assyrian kings, the Sumerians, everyone, when they were coming up from the first dynasties after the Cataclysms, they were called the beekeepers. When Adam Weishaupt was first founding the Bavarian Illuminati, he wanted to call it the beekeepers. The bee is very sacred, and not only Freemasonry, but the bee was sacred to the great Christian king, Charlemagne. The bee is sacred all across. And these are not just the pollinators on the earth, of repollinating the earth after these cataclysms, but they're the pollinators of humanity. And they have had a great duty in there. So here's another Jordan Maxwell story. So one night I'm walking with Jordan Maxwell under the desert stars in California. And we're looking up and he says, Johnny, do you see that? That's the second brightest star in the sky. And he said, you know, well, we start talking about Sirius. And how this connects to the mysteries. And if any of you have ever seen, you know, in Peter Pan, Disney's Peter Pan, how they are going to the second brightest star in the sky, Neverland, that's Sirius. It's a dog star. It's where we get dogma from, okay? But also, this is the blazing star of Freemasonry, Sirius. So are they trying to tell you that this is where these traditions come from on this planet? When you look over at Sirius, though, he would tell me, he'd say, do you know why we say sir to each other? The kingly, you know, we have that gentlemanly title, sir, and then it came from sire. When we go back, it was a kingly title. This comes from Sirius, or Osiris in Egypt. And this is also a connection, he would say. Do you know why he would say to me that you say, that guy over there is a fellow, or I fell in love? He'd say those are from the fallen ones. You know, we say the fallen angels, the extraterrestrials that came here. So we find connections all over the place, back to Egypt and back to this idea. And for those of you who have been to Egypt here, have you ever been to this place, Abu Sir? Okay, so you've been there. When you're there, we've had all kinds of discrepancies about what these are. Some people say they're sacrificial bulls, which they've never found any trace evidence of any other liquids or anything there. Stephen Mailer, in his book, The Land of Osiris, says that his teacher, the great Abdel Hakim Ayawan, had said that this is the place where the great beings, the gods, had landed on earth. They were the beings from Sirius. They were the beings connected to Osiris, and this was the place where they would come down. There used to be a great crystal obelisk where my friend John T. Long is lying there. But this is a place that was very much connected to this, so we have a serious connection into the mysteries. When you guys see the gods of Egypt, you see all kinds of very interesting characters. And you might ask yourself, who are they? Where did they come from? Well, according to the great historian Plutarch, he said the gods of ancient Egypt were the antediluvian, or pre-flood, pre-cataclysmic kings who were deified or made into gods after death. So who were they? Well, if we go look over at who Osiris was, he was a giant with an elongated skull. And if you don't think giants exist, this is one of the few sarcophagi or coffins over there in the Cairo Museum that are 15 to 20 foot tall. It says next to them, enormous coffin. You say, where are the bodies? They shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know, probably in the basement. So where do giants come from? Well, we have an idea of ETs all through our ancient scriptures, so to speak, and talking about angels in this kind of way. And maybe I think at times we've mixed up the idea of what angels are. Maybe they have been extraterrestrials. At other times, maybe we do have different spiritual beings. You know, it says in the book of Hebrews 13:2, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitalities to angels without knowing it. But it also has a reference to where giants come from. It says that in the apocryphal book of Enoch, it says in Watchers 6, 7, and 8, it says that the fallen angels that had come here had laid with the daughters of man, and they produced an offspring of giants. So it's telling us that we had this mix matching on earth that was taking place. Okay, we also start to see, while we're on the subject of these rulers with elongated skulls, we start to see the arrival of this guy when we look into the ancient Chaldeans. We see Dagon, Nimrod, Oannes. He came to a very primitive people of Babylonia. They see this guy come to them. He was a good man. He had an elongated kind of fish hat. And I think this depicts a seafaring people with the scales on them. And he gave them their culture, taught them how to make fires and showed them medicine, just like Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan did to the people of the Yucatan. In fact, the people of the Yucatan believed in that so much that their God was going to return to them, that it seeded their civilization. And when Cortez arrived from the Spanish, they just capitulated and gave him everything. Said, oh, our master, you've returned. So they very much believed in this. Of course, we saw Osiris. In Egyptian mythology, we see this guy, Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, which we're going to talk about a little bit more shortly. Amenhotep IV, he depicted himself and his whole family with having these elongated skulls. But he also depicted himself as a hermaphrodite-like being with the hips of a woman and the features of every man on earth, the universal man. And some people have said, oh, this has got to be evidence that he's an alien. Well, actually, his father, Amenhotep III, had quite a regular skull, and so did his son, Tutankhamun. So what we believe is that he wanted to return to the period of Aten, the cycle of Aten, which was the cycle of Atlantis, where men and women were equal. There was no patriarchy. So he was trying to depict this. If we go to the Berlin Museum, you'll see this mask shows him to be quite normal when you see that. We find other depictions in Egypt that there were people around with these elongated skulls, just like Osiris at other times. Very interestingly enough, this is with Daniel Sheehan. I think you know that event. Daniel Sheehan and I, we were talking for a while in the car on the way back from one of Jordan's events. And he was telling me that over at the Vatican Library that they have records of extraterrestrials there. There's all kinds of interesting stuff going on there. But this woman, Karen Hughes, she made some very interesting statements. Did any of you guys ever catch what she said? She said, as a World Bank insider, she said that at the Vatican Library there was a second species in control of the show with humanity that were there, and that they had these elongated skulls. It's very interesting. She made some very curious comments. Okay, skipped a few slides there. That's just giving you guys a couple sneak peeks of what's to come. Okay, the ancient Hungarians. This is an interesting connection we find here to ancient Egypt and the mysteries. Do we have any Hungarians here? Anybody that knows any Hungarians?
I have Hungarian ancestors.
Okay, good enough. Well then, I'll take it. I'll take it. What's very interesting, okay, this whole area is very interesting. I think people should take a very good look at this whole area because this connects to our ancient Egyptian civilizations. It's fascinating. When you look at the Hungarians, they call themselves the Magyar. They call their country Magyarország, and they speak Magyarul, but they are the Magyar. And what's very interesting about this is that the ancient area of Hungary, which used to be part of something called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it used to contain Österreich, which was Austria. It contained Croatia, which was very important to the Knights Templars. It contained, Prague, Czech Republic, all these sorts of places. Very interesting because there's tunnels under all these places and so many crazy, interesting things. But the ancient Egyptians, their term for a mug or a cup was Magyar, right there. And if you look at the topographical map for Hungary, which also went into Romania, in Bucharest, and Buceci in Transylvania, and all those sorts of places, it connected over to there, which they told us in this Magyar configuration, in the name Magyar, that this was very much part and parcel of their civilization. And we see connections to that everywhere there. One other interesting fact is, I don't know if a lot of you know this, there's only 3 official languages spoken at the U.S. Federal Reserve: English, Mandarin, and Hungarian. So that will give you something to think about later when you start thinking about the secret societies and things that popped up out of there and the importance to the ancient world. This is an area that you all need to do some research on if you haven't already. This is a fascinating area. When you look up at the Eurasian Mountains and the Ural Mountains, this is very, very interesting. We find this thing up there called the Dashka Stone. The Dashka Stone. Have any of you ever heard of that? Okay. When you go 30 miles up and you're going to space, you can see this thing. This is a topographical map of the Earth. It's a 1-ton mega relief. It was a part of a 30-ton mega relief. NASA has confirmed that there is 3 ancient rivers that are showing up out of this, like an ancient guidance system. Okay? And these ancient rivers that you're seeing that are depicted here have now gone underground, but this is just like the story of Jason and the Argonauts. When you go look over at the Indus Valley, these were a navigational system on the Earth that whoever was using it 30 miles up from space was able to see down here on Earth where they were going. It also had 120 million-year-old fossilized shells found inside of it. Now, this is a very, very interesting area. The Russians found these little nano gold wires in little, what looks like computer chips. This is a real discovery. We also find in the area all kinds of different depictions and strange ideas that almost look like aliens. We find petroglyphs. We find caves nearby there that have all kinds of what looks like little reliefs of chemical structures. That whole area of the Eurasian area is fascinating, and that's where the Hungarians believe they actually came from. We call them these Uralic connections. We also find connected to the ancient people of Bulgaria, Russia, and Hungary. In Hungary, we find connections to these elongated skulls.
Are those not Scythians? The folks
Yes,
that are on
yes,
the ancient
absolutely, yes,
Am I not right?
yes.
That's what I thought.
Absolutely, and then connecting back into Persia and everything. You know your stuff. It's very impressive. You should be up here with me.
No, I studied this for 40 years.
I love it. That's awesome. That's why I'm glad you're here. And so it's interesting. What's interesting about that area, though, the Ural Mountains that we were just talking about, when you go into that area, in those areas, the northern Black Sea, Crimea, and Scandinavia, we find the greatest deposit of these elongated skulls. And actually, this gentleman up here has an elongated skull, Jordan. One of the elongated skulls that was used in the testing by L.A. Marzulli and Brien Foerster originally, I believe that one was from Lima, wasn't it?
Well, origin exactly unknown, actually.
Interesting. Brian, I was talking to Brian on the way here. He thought he had it written down in his notes. The Oregon skull is the Lima skull. So I don't know where. Maybe he mixed it up on another one in his testing. But he's got some new ones from Paracas. What's interesting about that? So over in that area by Ural back there, northern Black Sea, Crimea, Scandinavia, we find similar ones over in Paracas by Peru. And Brian had these tested, and they were totally strange because they didn't have the usual haplogroups that we'd see with the Inca or the Native Americans who we used to think crossed the Bering Land Bridge or the Bering Land Strait. They would have been A, B, C, D, and X for the haplogroups. They had a different group, UTE1, and they're now considered Homo sapiens sapiens Paracas. Okay, we have a different total classification of hominid when we start looking over here. We have a different species, essentially. I don't know how this slide showed up here, but this is the one I wanted to mention 2 slides ago. It must have bounced around. So we got this idea in all kinds of places. I'm sure you guys have seen these before. When you visited England, you've seen these lovely hats on the soldiers, and then we see this, and we can only think that they're trying to tell us something. So when we look at certain connections, like I was saying, we're all connected to Egypt. Some of the latest genetic testing we find from King Tutankhamun is it says half of European men share King Tut's DNA. The results showed that King Tut belonged to a genetic profile group known as haplogroup R1B1A2. Okay, so we find connections over in England to this. And actually the royal family is telling you it, and they're shoving it right in your face, but they don't admit to it. And this is how they do it. It's very clever. Okay, so have any of you visited Windsor Castle before? I've been over there. Okay, very interesting place when you go. There's a little place called St. George's Chapel, and it's the home of this thing called the Order of the Garter. And it's a very distinguished order. If you become knighted and get to join the club, it's a fantastic thing. But we get this nice story about the Order of the Garter that everybody parades around with this order, that it came from this nice guy that we're told, King Edward III. And Edward III, we go back to 1325, Middle French period. Middle England had French speaking going on there. And the story is when he was there that people were dancing and having a good time, and the Countess of Salisbury was dancing there. And we're told her garter fell. So him being the chivalrous gentleman that he was, which actually we hear opposite stories historically, him being the chivalrous gentleman, we're told that he said, "Honi soit qui mal y pense." Shame on him who think evil of it. And this became the motto of the Order of the Garter, based on this woman's garter, this silly order that we're told about. Well, actually, that story is a bunch of nonsense. If you go talk to the British historians there, which I have also, and you learn deeper about the story and its symbolism, you learn that it's the Order of the Garter, as in to guard or protect something. Okay, it has nothing to do with a woman's garter. That's nonsense. And actually what you see here, this is the chapel at St. George's. You'll see that it's set up in a very interesting way. According to the 17th century British historians, how it was set up is it was set up according to a very hard-to-get book called the Black Book of Hermes, and it was the arrangement of the seating of kings. And this was seated in the way that all the rulers of antiquity, the gods of antiquity, the antediluvian gods of antiquities that ruled over the world. That's why you see all the flags of the nations on earth. This was the inspiration for the Great League of Nations that later became the UN. And you also notice the checkered floor, like a Masonic hall. It's got a lot of very interesting depictions. But what they're trying to tell you is that we are the guardians and protectors and descendants and inheritors of the antediluvian rulers that were here. And our guards have those little hats to remind you of it. There's another story we get that comes from Egypt. And this is... some people laugh at this story, and they think it's nonsense. Others take it very serious, and I'll tell you there are people that do take it very serious. We get this idea that Akhenaten, the guy we talked about, his daughter Skoda actually came to the areas of Scotland and Ireland. That's where Scotland and Ireland got their names. Scotland was named after Skoda. And we see the burial area that many people believed is Skoda's grave in Tralee, County Kerry, Ireland. We have connections to this over at the Hill of Tara as well. But over here, the name for Ireland, the ancient name for Ireland was actually Scotia. So that's where it got its name. Just like Nova Scotia in Canada. Does anybody know who that is? Charleston Heston. Yes. Yes. The greatest Second Amendment activist. No. This, of course, is Moses in the movie The Ten Commandments. And, you know, we have a lot of very interesting stories about it. But it is based, like most stories, off of many others. You know, we see the personification of these great stories as they come along. And Sigmund Freud and many others believed that one of the composite characters it was based off of was this man, Akhenaten, who we were talking about earlier, who he left behind Egypt. He left behind the priests of Amun-Ra. And he said, I do not want to be under this opposition and this corruption of the gods of Egypt at that time. And he went towards the Aten, which was that idea of the light and those helping hands that we get from that area. Is that Hathor that you have on your neck? Oh, it's beautiful. So he leaves out of this particular area and he says, I'm going to follow the Aten, which some people said this is like a monotheistic god. And we actually break down the name of his brother that kind of translates similarly over to Aaron. And again, Amun, this became a rather corrupt power in Egypt after a while in that cycle. We get these areas, when we go over to Karnak. Karnak was dedicated to Amun-Ra, but we still see the previous cycle of Egyptians that were there that had a different iconography. They had sky gods, the symbolism that they were using. This means, when we look at Amun-Ra, what it means is to be kept in secret or to keep something hidden. All three Abrahamic religions say Amen at the end of their prayers, to keep it secret, to keep it hidden. And so this is a very interesting connection that they are essentially serving that God when they say it. We get this idea of the Ten Commandments that we say from these Hebrew traditions. We say that Moses was given the Ten Commandments on the mountain of Sinai from the fiery finger of God that burned them into the tablets. Well, actually, in the Hebrew books, it tells us in the book of Yasher, it states that Moses received the edicts of the Decalogues of the Ten Commandments from Jethro. He didn't receive them at all in that way into the tablets. And the Ten Commandments are actually based on something much longer, from the 42 divine principles of Matt. I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery of violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men or women. It's a short version that had been around for a long time. This story here that we have, the Ark of the Covenant, we're told it's a Hebrew story, but if you look at the Bible dictionaries, we actually know it was adapted from the Egyptian. It's an Egyptian story. In fact, if I had lots and lots of time, which I know you guys will probably fall asleep by then, I could go through all the different arks in Egypt. You see, and they're very interesting. We're going to get into the ark, why it's so interesting. But we find that this ark was called the Ark of the Contract, and it was mentioned over in Edfu. It was mentioned over in Abu Simbel. We see this ark doing all kinds of interesting things, like levitating boats in their depictions. We see mock arks in some places. When we read the King James Version of the Bible and we go back, we find in Exodus 32:20 that Moses is quite angry at that point. He's angry because the Israelites at the bottom of the mountain, they started gathering up these gold earrings and jewelry, and Aaron was with them. They started shaping it into a golden calf, if you remember the story. And there's all kinds of symbolism we find within the Moses story here. But what's interesting is then he gives them, when Moses comes down the mountain, he gets quite angry. And he sees them and he says, here, I've come with this new, divine word, and here I see you guys having other gods before. Then he orders them to burn the golden calf, to grind it into a powder, and consume it. Now, why would he do that? It's a very odd thing to say. Go home and read your Bible again if you want to see what it says. It's very strange. To understand this area, we have to go back to 1904. This is one of the most interesting discoveries. If you guys have never heard this discovery, or maybe you have, I'd suggest you revisit it. This is a very interesting science here. and it connects directly into today's ufology. In 1904, there's a man named Sir William Flinders Petrie. And Sir William Flinders Petrie was working with the British Royal Geography Society. So he goes on a special mission into the Sinai to find the Moses Mountain. And he goes up to this place, Serabit al-Qadim, or we call it Mount Harob. And when he goes up into this area, he accidentally discovers a temple dedicated to the goddess that's on her necklace, Hathor. And so what's interesting about this is that Hathor also has the ears of a calf. And he was talking about a golden calf, what's very interesting. A lot of people believe Hathor was extraterrestrial. And you go over to Dendara and everything. We'll get into that also. But the idea is when he goes there, he steps into this temple. He's not sure what he's going to find. The first thing he finds is he finds these hermetically sealed chambers. And he starts to slide the lids open very slowly. And what he finds is these big piles of white powder. He thinks he's at Charlie Sheen's house. No, only joking. What he finds out is first they look at it and they go, maybe this is bone powder. Maybe it's just aluminum, the British say it that way. They let it blow all over the way and get adulterants in it. It starts to become polluted. Then they realize it's something very significant. And upon the walls they noticed that it says all the way from the 4th dynasty up into the 19th dynasty that they were coming to this particular temple for these specific rituals of eating this material. And we call this material mufkuts. Or in the ancient times we would call it the manna, that we connect with the Ark of the Covenant, or they call it Shemana. In the Septuagint Bible from the Greek, we call it the bread of the presence. It had a very interesting name to it. It was believed that when you consumed it, it did things to you. It regenerated you. It gave you extra life. The Egyptians had an idea that you had 3 types of bodies. They said you have a Ba, a Ka, and an Ak. Now, when you're astral projecting or you're leaving your body, you're coming out in this form. But you have a light body, your Ka, which is kind of like your auric field, that we can capture using Kirlian photography, your electromagnetic energy field that's around your body that we know we can measure. So the Egyptians very much believed that there was something else going on with us and that we could feed it. Again, the temple there that's connected to Hathor. In Dendara, we have this very, very famous glyph that's on this relief. It's in the crypts down below the basement of Dendara's temple, the Hathor temple in Dendara. And not too long ago, I was talking to Jimmy Church, and he was telling me, Johnny, I'm positive that this is a light bulb. I have a friend that reconstructed it. I said, Jimmy, I don't know about that. I don't think it was a light bulb, guys. I'll explain to you what I think it was, and you can check it out. Remember I was telling you what a Ka is? I want you to look very carefully around this giant. These are the dynastic Egyptians over here, the smaller dynastic Egyptians. Do you see very carefully that there's a pronounced line that looks like an aura? Do you see a second body? It's a little hard to see on the giants. Okay, so there's a Ka that's a very pronounced body. They had tapped into these serpentine energies. And remember I was telling you about the caduceus. And we have this idea of these Djed pillars, which we find in the mysteries, which are like the 33 vertebrae of your spine, or raising the Kundalini energy. Notice that we find them raising this energy of the serpent. And there's a couple other of these that are more detailed even, that start to show us what happens once it's raised. But this guy in the middle we call He. And He represents infinity and eternity. So these are the dynastic Egyptians seeking the power of the serpentine energies in the lotus bowls that they're awakening, and they had an ability that they were instructed only for specific people had this knowledge. Remember, only the priests and the kings could go and tap into this knowledge, and it was from the 4th to the 19th dynasty in that particular place. Now, why that's significant is when we go into the map of the dynastic Egyptians, their civilization took off after the 4th dynasty. It skyrocketed through the roof. Before that, it was very sluggish. Something happened that caused them to turn the light bulb on. They tapped into something, another force of energy, something else that was happening that was very significant. We have science that comes out of Egypt. I don't know if you guys know this, but the name for Egypt was never Egypt in the ancient world. Egypt is something that came from the Greeks. They came over to Memphis. They went to a temple to Ptah, Hepka-Ptah, and they called it Aegyptos, Egypt. Before that, it was called Kem, or Kemet, which meant the black land. This was the black volubious, or black sodium-filled alkali soil that would rise up from the Nile. And this is where you get the word chemistry and alchemy from. The science of alchemy and chemistry and everything, even practiced by the Essenes that you were mentioning over there with the mysteries earlier, that all came from here. So we have a very interesting discovery that came out from this man. Have any of you ever familiarized yourself with the David Hudson story? Do you know it? Now, if you've been an old-time David Hudson fan, looked at it before, maybe you became disenchanted with the story. Maybe you dismissed it over the years. Well, I'm going to throw a little bit of new information over your way, so maybe I can excite you guys to get interested in it again if you've lost interest. Because I know a lot of guys that said, oh, I'm not interested anymore because they've been told nothing happened with David Hudson, he gave up. Well, that's not true. I have other information. David Hudson was a simple cotton farmer, okay, from the Yuma Valley in Phoenix, Arizona. And after the 1970s, he was growing disenchanted with the mismanagement of the banking system and Jimmy Carter, who he was getting very frustrated with. So he decides to go and look into minerals and gold and things like that. But he had $8 million to play with, $4 million trust or line of credit, and a lot more money sitting around in the bank accounts to play with. He was, doing his thing, working with his cotton crops. And I don't know if any of you guys have looked at the agriculture over there in Arizona, but the land itself has this black sodium-filled alkali soil, just like we were saying with Egypt, right? And to grow cotton to any substantial length over there, he had to get 93% sulfuric acid from the local copper mines, and he had to put it on his land. So what happened is that the land would turn white and frothy into a white alkali, and it would become water-soluble. But something weird started happening. This strange material started showing up in the land. And at first it turned blood red, and then it turned black. And it wouldn't dissolve. It was acting like gold, like a noble metal, which was very strange. So he goes to get it tested. And so he brings it over to a PhD scientist, and he uses a machine called an electrospectron microscope. And it uses these 2 carbon electrodes between an arc that heats up when you heat it up, and then you bang it, and it tests this thing. But it only tested it for 15 seconds, and after you removed the iron, the silica, and everything from it, it wasn't showing up as nothing. It was just, nothing was happening, but he knew there was more going on there because just the way it acted. It acted like a noble metal. It acted like it's got to be gold or something of that nature. So then what he does is he talks to a couple friends and he reads a book from the Soviet Academy of Sciences. And he learns from this book that there's another way of testing this. Instead of doing it only for 15 seconds, which at the time was the American method, he goes and learns that he can do it for 300 seconds. He finds an expert, they go and do it, and sure enough, what they discover is that this stuff starts showing up with everything in the platinum group of metals. Iridium, ruthenium, rhodium. He starts getting gold, platinum, all these sorts of things, but they're in a special state that he's able to extract, which he then labeled orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements. There was a key component to how they could act. And he starts saying that you can find this thing all throughout nature. You can find it in oceanic sources and volcanic sources, he found. Anywhere that had been exposed to heat. This was a very, very interesting material. And when scientists were testing it, they found out that it could use some unique properties. He found that it had anti-gravitational levitation properties when you exposed it to heat or electromagnetic energy. When you put it on geomagnetic areas of the Earth, it started to basically get lighter. So this is very interesting. We have this connection that he starts to find. Now remember what we told you, or what we were discussing just a moment ago about the Egyptians, where they were finding a white powder. And remember, his land was a black sodium-filled alkali soil, just like Kemet in Egypt, where it gets its name. He finds a process, and he starts seeing that he has this material that's very active. Now, there was a man that had documented this greatly, that I love to pay tribute to, the great Lawrence Gardner, and he wrote about this in The Lost Secrets of the Ark and the Genesis of the Grail Kings, and he did a marvelous job of documenting this if you ever want to look it up. But essentially, this stuff is star stuff. Now, what's unique about this stuff and why a lot of people miss the mark with it. If you try to buy it on the internet, you're going to have a hard time finding the version that the ancient Egyptians had. And if you know someone that's making it, they probably won't be around for long, okay? Because David Hudson figured out how to make it like the Egyptians. So what this stuff is that you have the right protons, electrons, and neutrons arranged in a certain way. It has certain properties. And what they found out is that when you break these down in a certain way, you look at the atom. Now, when you look at these electrons that are whizzing around the nuclei, what he started to find, the electron shell had been stripped away. We had anti-electrons bonding with electrons, and they started to push away into a toroidal field that kind of matches our DNA. That's why when they were giving it to people in these sort of tests, it was finding that it was reversing different illnesses in the body. It was giving all sorts of incredible health benefits. But it also had sort of energy applications and weapon applications, which attracted the likes of Merck. It attracted all sorts of attention from different areas. He goes to patent the process of extracting this stuff, and the government steps in and takes his patents in the name of national security. They say, wait a second, you're not going to have that stuff. We don't want you having it. Do you know why? Once you go down in this atomic structure, and ladies and gentlemen, this is the elite science of today. It's not called Oramus or Oramy like these guys were calling it, you know, in David Hudson's days. In 1995, he was lecturing on this in Dallas. These days, it's called hyperdeformed nuclei, exotic matter. There's all kinds of names we look at it. Once you go down here, you go down from quarks, go down into your subatomic particles. Quarks, neutrinos, hadrons, leptons. Down you go down to gluons and bosons. What do we get with gluons and bosons? You can fit an entire galaxy now, they believe, in a gluon. And when we get gluons and bosons, we get pure photonic energy. Now imagine fitting that into a box like the Ark of the Covenant. You got the perfect weapon, perfect energy source. And you also have no gravity at that level, by the way, they tell us. But David Hudson was bragging that his scientists had figured out how to get the atomic clusters down really small. He was breaking this down. And I've talked to certain chemists and physicists and people about this subject that know about it. And they were telling me that when even if you take gold, isotope 79, you start breaking these things down, they become unstable. You start getting some very interesting and strange activity. Look at the flower of life, by the way. It looks like what we see with the hyperdeformed nuclei in that oval particular shape. There's a very interesting science. This science inspired all of our alchemy ideas, especially we were talking about earlier. If you look at the European alchemists, this is Paracelsus. He was born Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Heinem, by the way. That's what we call him, Paracelsus for short. You have Roger Bacon. You have the likes of your great John Dee and Edward Kelly. If any of you have ever been to Prague, have you ever been to the Czech Republic? When you go there, they have the Golden Lane. You go back into the ideas. They were obsessed, absolutely obsessed with alchemy there.
Isaac Newton was an alchemist.
Absolutely he was. He definitely was. A lot of our great sciences were born out of these chemists during the European times, like even Fulcanelli, who said that once you got involved with real alchemy, you were tapping into a field of force. It was born because they were trying to find this elixir of life, the philosopher's stone, the Nicholas Flamel and others were talking about. They were trying to tap into this. But the idea is that they couldn't get to it in quite the way that the Egyptians figured out. They figured out something really interesting. And I'll tell you, that ark had a lot to do with it. Look at the electrodes that you'd see, how the energy was moving through it. The ark was a weapon. They figured out how to use it. And I'll tell you, there's some conspiracies in the history circles, the historical circles I run with anthropologists and people, that they believe if you go back to that group called the Tartars, or the Tartarians, that they're wiping out all the Russians and the Hungarians and just killing them just by the thousands. People say, how are they doing that? Well, they had an ark-like device they got their hands on with the Khans and the Mongolians. And that's been hushed up. Somebody knows something. That brings us back to this man, Bob Lazar. You want to ask if there was extraterrestrial involvement with Egypt, with this sort of technology we're talking about? Have any of you guys seen the new documentary about Bob Lazar on Netflix? Okay, if you've seen the new documentary on Netflix, you'll hear him talking about when he went over to Area 51, he said there was these 9 hangars. He saw these UFOs. One of them was from an archaeological dig, a place that they had dug up. But the UFO that Bob Lazar saw, he run his hand across the UFO and it was smooth. It was a crazy sight to see. He said it was ominous. There was no right angles. It was completely smooth, like it had been shaped out of this incredible perfection. But he said, how these UFOs were powered up was he saw this element that was there. He said it was called element 115. You guys remember hearing about that? Now, go listen very carefully to what Bob Lazar is now saying on Larry King. Go listen to what he's saying on Joe Rogan. He's talking about element 115 is very dangerous because it's this heavy element we didn't discover till later. But when you refine it in a certain way with the right protons, electrons, and neutrons, and you bring it down into that particular way we were just talking about with David Hudson, he said it could be weaponized. It acts different when you expose it to radioactive sources or heat. There's a particle accelerator down there. He basically is describing exactly what Hudson ran into. And I can tell you right now, without getting, I don't want to get into too much trouble, so I'll just keep this at a limited amount. Maybe you guys can fill in the blanks. When Hudson was told to shut down, everyone said he gave up. He never gave up. I'll just tell you, you get kind of an option in those cases that says, you know, either you can come work for us and tell everyone you give up and take the defeat, or you can keep going. So I will tell you there is something there. It is very significant, and the Egyptians understood this. They also called what we look back at the pyramid. Where does pyramid come from? We look at the Greek. Pyramid, the fire in the middle. They were looking at the firestone. Perhaps this is how they were able to make it levitate, working on these geomagnetic sites. Here's an interesting one for you guys. You know, if you're in Egypt, you see this one plant called the thorny plant grow everywhere. These grow close to geomagnetic sites. They're very sensitive to energy. The Egyptians only built by these particular sites. The Druids, who we believe probably came from the ancient Phoenician Canaanites, who had the cedars of Lebanon to travel, they were very obsessed with the oak, ash, and thorn, the hawthorn. They knew that it had magnetic properties. These guys understood it very much. Now remember, this material could become lighter or heavier. When you look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you get this idea that your transgressions are being weighed before you, and you're talking before Matt, and you're weighing your sins. And the traditional idea we get is that you could have all this stuff weighed against you, that you weren't very nice and you disobeyed all the commandments we talked about. But if someone on earth was thinking of you, that you had done one nice deed for them, one random act of kindness, you'd get this little feather that would balance out and make things lighter. Well, we have an idea that the Egyptians understood a sort of hyperspace, multi-dimensional technology, that this is a lighter, a process of becoming lighter, just like what we're describing with this material. Now, if you go over to Karnak in Egypt, or Thebes, the city of gates, we get the idea that this was a very important and significant place. It's overwhelming to visit when you visit it, for those that have visited Egypt, for you guys that have walked through it. But over in Karnak, there was a guy there named Thutmose III. Now, Thutmose III is very important in Masonic circles. It's very important to the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucians believe it's their deputy Grand Master. He's still running the show. He's an immortal. Okay? He had something called the Great White Brotherhood that was written about extensively over in Alexandria, and they had their office, basically, where they would hang out at the very back of Karnak, where the sun would beam down over into a giant obelisk and charge things up. Well, he was obsessed with eating these white cakes. That's why they called it the Great White Brotherhood. And when he was obsessed with eating these things, they attained immortality through doing this, regenerating the body, upgrading their abilities. These particular elements that they had all kinds of great gifts to give them when they ate it, and they looked like these little cakes that they were consuming. We called mufkuts. Now, here's another very interesting temple. This is a temple called Abydos. Very interesting place. When you've been to Egypt, did you get to go to Abydos? Abydos is a very, very strange, a wonderful place. You see 3 sets of stairs, platforms going up. Now, the average person will tell you that this was a healing temple. They'll say, oh, it's all the pretty colors that would heal you. I would look at this thing always, and I'd say, that's nonsense. I'd see it, and I'd say, this is an ascension temple. We have 42 stairs, like the 42 pieces of Osiris for his resurrection. We have the 3 layers, like the 3 chambers of the Great Pyramids, the 3 degrees of masonry. Entered apprentice, fellow craftsman, master mason. You go into the particular chambers, and you only got to go into this part of the temple if you were someone really important who had done the work. When you go in there, what we first notice So Erzsébet over there actually spotted it, actually. She saw me lecturing on this, the Mufkuts, and she said, oh my God, this is a Mufkuts temple. She pointed it out to me. She said, this is everywhere. Turns out that they were majorly eating the Mufkuts at this temple. And before this, on my previous visit, Mohamed, my friend who I do the tours with, he was always skeptical of the Mufkuts theory. And he says, my friend, I have to give in. They are eating this white cake, and we have no white cake like that. And now he's a big believer, when you see this temple, that this temple was all about the manufacturing and eating of the Mufkuts. I was there with my friend, Jonathan Hague. He's a lawyer from London, living in Mauritius. And he came there with us, and he's very intuitive. He's very sensitive. And he was seeing the temple where all these signs were, and he says to me, oh my God. He says, I'm getting a download. I'm picking this up. This back room here, we started following the release in the hieroglyphics. This is where they were cooking and preparing the Mufkuts, like a laboratory. And this laboratory where they were cooking it, the ceiling was black and it has a chimney up there. So they were literally coming in there and cooking it and eating it in large amounts. But why were they doing it? Why were they eating this bread of the presence? What was it doing to them? What kind of qualities was it giving them? When you're in this temple, we have 7 rooms. And here's Mohamed lecturing another group. When you're in there, there's these 7 rooms, and we call these doors to the netters. And the netters, I'll spare you a lot of time because I know everyone's can only has such a seating capacity tonight. When you see these doors, they don't go anywhere, but all these rooms have a tonal frequency. They're tuned to a certain energy. And we're told that their doorways are portals to another place. But what we also see, it's very significant, that I'll get to shortly, is that in this place, in front of these doors, it says Stargate. You go somewhere. You had to eat the Mufkuts. It upgraded your Ka, your energy field. You stepped into an energy grid powered on by the Osirion in the back, and this was some sort of a portal system, which was a very interesting key that connected us to the gods. Now, a lot of people have looked on Ancient Aliens and other shows, and they've seen this. Have you guys ever seen that? The helicopter, plane glyph, and everything? And up until this point, even Mohamed made this sketch a few years ago. He says, Johnny, no. He says, not a helicopter. He goes, that's nonsense. So even myself, he had me thinking it's not a helicopter. He said, this is what we call in archaeology a palimpsest. It's when we have erosion over times and we have glyphs on top of glyphs that are superimposed into this particular area, and we go there. Now, after he saw the new Abydos theory with the white cakes, the stargates and everything, he's going, okay, time travel, access technology, we have the connection here that maybe they did this on purpose, that they allowed us to see this there. We have a connection, actually, in Egypt to the idea that people were flying. We have this idea that there could have been flying machines. The bird of Saqqara. Saqqara, by the way, is where you get the word sacred. This is the bird of Saqqara, perfectly with a fin and everything, a tail fin. And we have over here the flying man at Abydos, the bird man, the idea that they had ascended with wings. We have an idea connecting these gods that could fly and coming here also back to the Atlanteans, the Egyptians, and the ancient world. Here's a quote from the great Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. He said, the people of the earth shall meet the people of the universe. As we approach the golden age, the veils shall be removed and the people of the earth shall become aware of the people of the universe. Edgar Cayce said that. That's pretty incredible. You see, in the ancient Atlantean times, we're told by the Theosophists that they were corrupted by the evil King Tetvahat, the ruler of the air. In the biblical texts, it tells us to watch out for the Cosmocratorus, the principalities and powers in higher places. We see back in India, in the Mahabharata, the Samarangana Sutradhara, and other texts, it tells us about the Vimanas that are coming here. We have this idea that we could have had very advanced people at different times, and the Egyptians knew about that somehow. They encoded that into Abydos. It says here, little known historical fact, pharaohs were buried with their arms crossed because they believed there would be countless water slides in the afterlife. Actually, the sarcophagi that you see, most of the sarcophagi are made of granite, and a lot of the time we've never found bodies in them. They are a type of ancient consciousness technology, is what I believe. Okay? When you see these tombs, they had understood it's sort of a cosmic internet. These spells are very interesting. When you go here with psychics, like Erzsébet back there and my friend Jonathan Hague, they pick up amazing things that they've never been told. They can still see things in the spells that Muhammad will tell them. How'd you know that there was 2 giant serpents there? There seemed to be this cross threshold that was there that was very interesting. The ancient Egyptians had this idea, actually. If you go back into Saqqara, into the 5th dynasty pyramid texts, they understood a secret dimension or realm between our worlds that they could access. That they had an ability, by stepping into one of these boxes, they'd go into this particular place called the Field of Mufkuts. To the Babylonians, we called it the Plain of Sharon. We have a couple places, like the Celts, they talk about the realm of the Shining Ones. This is over at the Vatican here. At the Vatican, we have the Fontana della Pigna, the fountain of the pine cone. Now, for many of you who've studied the mysteries, you'll know that the pine cone is the king, or the crown, of the endocrine glands. It's the pineal gland. I saw you nodding, you know it. So we find with it, it's where your DMT, your dimethyltryptamine, is being created. That's the stuff when you're dying or dreaming that's getting flooded into your brain. It's the most powerful psychedelic known to man. It's in everything out in nature. We find it around us, and you're having these trips every night when you go to sleep. It's also creating your serotonin and your melatonin at all times. Well, what's interesting at the Vatican is that it's right in front of the Egyptian wing of the museum, and right behind it we have an open sarcophagi. There's no lid on the sarcophagi, and we see Egyptian iconography on both sides. And it's telling you that when the single eye is open, great things start to happen. You transcend immortality. We find back here the egg, which is very significant, even going back into Sargon the Great. It represents not only the orifice egg, but it is the thalamus. And we see a connection into the body of a sort of an immortality connection that was understood. That's when we go to this place called the Serapeum. We find these giant granite boxes with no bodies that have been found. This is a very interesting place to go visit. We don't have any idea per se what they were used for. We see these later probably Greco-Roman scratches, this chicken scratch. It's a bunch of crap that's put on the side with an empty cartouche that the priests were going to try to sell to some poor sucker in one of these later death cults where they were trying to sell their religion, the death cult. But the actual Egyptians, they understood the earlier cycles. They understood that there was a type of technology here when they accessed the Field of Mufkuts and powered up these granite boxes. There was a sort of an energy. This was a certain class that went on to live in the world. It's said that, by the way, that when they went through this process, they transitioned into a dimension just above our world, which some people call hyperspace. That actually what happened is that when they would come back into our world, they would show up as these sort of shadow people. So I have a very interesting story about maybe how these sort of people have affected our world. If you look behind us, you'll see when we talk about the Constitution, which, by the way, I believe is not only one of the greatest documents ever written, but I believe it should be protected at all costs. But I also want to talk about the United States of America and the founding of it, which was no accident. It was born out of the ideals of Egypt. The colors behind the Star-Spangled Banner, red, white, and blue, we see go back into Atlantis. They go back into Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu. There's a very significant event that happened with the founding of the United States of America, and I don't know if you guys know this, but it was born under a secret Masonic constellation, America. And when you go back to this idea, if we look in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, he says that on July 4th, 1776, we go back to the Philadelphia State House. We have a very interesting story. These men gathered around in the room. We had the likes of Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine. You had Hancock. And they were all concerned. They were all worried about the redcoats. They were in fear for their lives because they wanted this freedom. But something very important happened that day. According to the writings of Thomas Jefferson, there stood behind closed doors a mysterious man that entered the room. And the mysterious man, he said, "Don't fear for your lives or persecution. God meant for America to be free. Now sign that document, damn it." And Hancock was so startled, we get the idea that his signature was so big. Some say it was because King George, he couldn't read a damn word, so he had to have this giant signature, but the other version we get is that he was startled by this signature. But some have wondered who that mysterious man could have been. Was it El Morye? Was it Saint Germain? Was it an extraterrestrial? Or one of these immortal members of a secret society, some believe was this Great White Brotherhood, which also has women in it, by the way, I have to tell you, in these other ideas, these ascended masters we hear. But we get this very interesting idea that this was no accident, and I very much believe that to be the case. Despite our grievances and hardships sometimes we all go through as a people, we eventually get somewhere special. Now, I thought about not including the slide originally tonight because I know we're getting on and on into the presentation. It's almost over, by the way. I promise you don't have to listen to my voice much longer. So we have an idea about who the ancient artificers were. If we've had a group of immortals, or maybe extraterrestrials working with us, different civilizations that have worked with us since these ancient civilizations. This is an ancient symbol. Have you guys ever seen this symbol before? It's called the Chi-Rho or the Chi-Rho. Okay? It's used a lot in masonry, Freemasonry. It's actually one of the secrets of York Rite Masonry, according to General Albert Pike at Manly Palmer Hall, is that they are the inheritors of a order that was belonged to by Constantine's father when we go to Constantine I. And they called themselves Collegius Artificam, the College of the Artificers. So there was a group called the Artificers that go back into ancient Egypt that all the kings and those folks belong to. It means the craftsmen, or the masons, or the alchemists, or the builders. Okay? So we see this order that goes back a long way that teaches the principles of generativity, immortality, and all these factions, which is very, very interesting. But they've played a great role in our world. In fact, they've seeded a lot of religions. The idea is that with Constantine, we get this idea that he saw this symbol apparently as a sign from the heavens that he was supposed to seed Christianity. It means the Christos, the letters in Greek that we see connected to it, the first two. But actually this symbol has been used 2,500 years prior. It goes back into Egypt, it goes all over the world. And you'll actually find that there's many of these groups that have seen many of our great civilizations through. From the Dionysian artificers to the Eleusinian mysteries, the greatest of all the mysteries. And when you look where Constantine's father was buried over in York, England, they found it with a mercury-lit, ever-burning lamp in the tomb that had been going just like the ones at the Appian Way, all over the world. A very big clue about the alchemists. But these folks, as I mentioned, have overseen civilizations from behind the scenes and seeded us there using certain heightened senses and knowledge that they've come along. And they always have a map in the certain religions when they come along. They find people that are a worthy candidate, and they pick people, and they say, okay, this guy looks like a good candidate, Dionysus or Horus. And you see, I'm a big believer that religion is a science. We should not dismiss it. You know, we see all sorts of astrotheology. We see things like the act of penance. You know, you can erase a good deed with the memory of a bad deed by doing a good deed and dedicating it to it. But we have an interesting idea even into our modern day that comes from these artificers that came along. And this is why in the York Rite Masonry, by using that symbol and being the Templars, the protectors over today's cycle of religion, over Christianity and these things, we see where does this come from? There was a very interesting idea with this, and I just want to share this story with you guys, and I hope it doesn't offend any religious folks, if there are any here, but I will tell you that this is what many people like the royal family believe, who their descendants actually are. And this is why it was picked out by the artificers, this gentleman. This is supposed to be the historical account about the true identity of Jesus. This is what many people believe. The idea is that according to Celsus of 155 AD, Anno Domini or CE, and in the Talmud, that there was a guy named Yeshua ben Pantera. And we call him Ben Pantera because it was the son of Panther. He was the son of Panther. And Panther was a Roman soldier. And Panther had relations with a woman that we call Mary, and Mary's an Egyptian name. And out of her, they bore a relationship of twins. And the one we call Judas would have been his twin brother. But of course, the idea that we get through this relationship is that this fellow, Panther, was not able to claim this relationship because, you know, the Romans were all about these erotic games and everything else like that. And so when he found out she had twins, he was bragging to all his friends. He said, oh, this is amazing. This is such great luck. It's a great luck of the gods when you have that sort of thing happen. But by that, he had special treatment. Sort of like we know the story of Sir Francis Bacon. He was the bastard son of Elizabeth I. He was born Sir Francis Tudor, but he was given special tutoring privileges and an upbringing that was fantastic. So the idea we get is that he was brought up, this was his historical identity, he was brought up and given all sorts of, of an education through the Essenes, and brought up through Alexandria and went through all kinds of training. And that's what many folks believe is the actual bloodline and descendancy that comes through there. But this was picked and brought together in a religion at the time through Constantine, through the order of the artificers, the Colleges Artificam. And this goes back to this order that comes out of Egypt. Now, I want to say that we're almost done, and I've left the best stuff for last. So don't worry, you get to come up out of this place and stretch pretty soon. This area is called Memphis. This was the major capital city of Egypt. When you saw the Great Pyramid of Giza, you would have been bored to tears with that in the ancient world. You would have said, oh, it's a power plant. I don't care about that. Just kept going. Memphis was where the action was at. Okay? That's where all the fun is. So outside of Memphis, we find some very interesting stuff, especially when we get on this topic of stargates to other places in the solar system, portals, vortices, all that kind of stuff. We see these depictions constantly in certain temples and areas about entering a stargate. We see these doors to the netters that don't go anywhere in these rooms. But here's a place that if you guys have a pen, write this down and look this up. This is a place you want to look up later on Wikipedia or whatever. Just do your research on this. Do yourself a favor and research this. This place is called Zayat Audion. It's right by Abu Sir and Abu Ghraib. Nobody's been able to go into it since the 1950s, 1960s. It's guarded by foreign intelligence agencies, and you're not allowed to go near it. And just so you know, according to my contacts, it's got a subterranean base under it the size of New York City, and aircraft can come in and out of it without being seen. It is Egypt's Area 51. And there's an active Stargate in there, by the way, that actually goes somewhere. A lot of these things that have been found around Egypt, they have found biokinetic interfacing devices and chairs that will transmit information to you. They've been removed and stored away there like a warehouse because we're the children. We can't really handle it. When we see the Sphinx, it really captures our imagination. Thanks to the work of the great Dr. Robert Schoch, he's used his water erosion hypotheses to now show us that the Sphinx is far older than we used to believe it was. We can now safely say that it's at least 12,000 years old. Say, okay, maybe it's pre-cataclysmic, which we very much think it is. But there are others that will say, well, its original head was based on Tefnut and Sekhmet, so it would have been there at the time of Leo, the constellation, the alignment. So we can go back 80,000 years, 160,000 years, or older perhaps. But here's another cool little fact for you. Do you guys ever pay attention to the fact that there's some wooden boards in front of the paw in the front? Did you know these boards come up at night for the last 30 years? And all my friends around the Giza Plateau see all the heavy machinery there extracting everything out of there? Did you know what Edgar Cayce said was under the paw of the Sphinx? Yeah, Atlantean Hall of Records, antediluvian records, in fact. Very much so. Well, I'm here to tell you that, what if there's something to that story? Boy, in fact, the Rosicrucians and others have had these maps of entrances under the Sphinx and what's been hidden there by lost ancient civilizations. And now that everything has been sanitized, you can now go under there. For years and years, Zaiwa said there was nothing there. And I can tell you there's more there, but I'm not allowed to comment on it at this time, or I'll lose my permission to go there. Anyways, this is over in Malta. This is me with a very friendly taxi driver, and I was getting him to show me around all these hard rock tracks in Malta and the Neolithic sites that go back to 3800 BCE. Very fascinating stuff, because we find these on the bottom of the ocean in lots of interesting places. But he was showing me that pointing to Egypt, we find the Sphinx head right there on the side of the rock. In Malta, we find Egyptian connections. We also find that over in Pakistan, we find what we call the Balochistan Sphinx, what looks like an ancient temple that's been put under there. Do you guys see a pattern here that it looks like we have a series of these sphinxes, all connected? So then we go back into the work of Herodotus. Herodotus tells us, he says, he starts talking about this group called the Dacians. And the Dacians, when we go up into this area of Buceci and the areas around Romania and whatnot, he starts to tell us about this being called Zamaxis. He was a funny fellow who would communicate with the sky gods. And he would go down underground. And remember, this area was connected to what we called ancient Magyar, connected to the Egyptians and the ancient world. And I've been down in these tunnels. We were just there recently. They're fantastic. The Romanian Orthodox Church has built a church on top of this ancient holy site, and they sell souvenirs, which is interesting. But you can visit this particular tunnel that Zalmaxis inhabited, which is interesting. The whole place is riddled with tunnels. This is me recently with this book here called Transylvanian Sunrise. Now, why this is interesting, this was written by a man named Peter Moon. And he goes into working with a guy who used a pseudonym called Radu Sinamar. And they talked about the idea that since 2002, what was discovered there by the Pentagon when they were doing certain scans is they found that up there was this Sphinx head with underground entrances and chambers in this particular area. And what's interesting is he said that there was not only a Hall of Records, but these different tunnel systems that they found in there that would take you to different places. Ancient Egypt, Tibet, and deeper into the earth. It's interesting because when I was up there, I ran into a guy that was with the Romanian military. He told me he knew the guy that used the name Radu Sinamar, said it was absolutely real. He says, did you know that we found Anunnaki giants buried in this area? There's a large crystal pyramid in that mountain. And it was so powerful, the crystal pyramid that's built there, I couldn't even fly my drone because of the geomagnetic interference, which was strange. It just crashed. Here's the illustrations we get. If you go up where we find this area, by the way, there's 3 mushroom structures up here called the Babel Sisters. And you find these mushroom structures and no one knows what they are. You find them over in Egypt at Abydos and other places where you find the stargates. You find the exact stone mushroom configurations on the reliefs of the walls, which is interesting. You go down into here, we have a dome-like structure. And in this dome structure, there was a projector. And this projector right here, according to the books that we find, it would project a Hall of Records onto the ceiling. And they found monoatomic white gold, just like we were talking about in there. And they found that in other places, by the way. I've talked to some officials, I can't name names, when I mentioned the gold, the white gold, they go, you know about that, eh? Like it's something that doesn't get talked about when it's discovered. When you go here, see it had an energy shield that had other ways of accessing these systems. It's a very interesting story indeed what's there. But also, we find a similar story over in Alaska, believe it or not. There was something called the Dark Pyramid that people talked about, especially Linda Moulton Howe has talked about it. It comes from a man named Douglas Mutchler. In 1992, he was, after being stationed there with the military, he and 40 of his buddies in the military are sitting there standing around watching TV. They hear the story that the Chinese have detonated a 1 megaton bomb. And they're monitoring it with seismologists and geologists to see what the effects are. And they find a large underground anomaly that's a pyramid structure larger than the Great Pyramid in Egypt. Okay? And it was near Mount Denali. And he goes down to the TV station to find out more information. They say, oh, this TV station manager says, I don't know what you're talking about. We never saw this program. Someone else comes to him from the station and says, no, that was a real story. We were told by officials to pull that story. Years later, Mutchler gets access to go and look at top secret files. He pulls the file over there, and just as he's reading up the file on Alaska, 2 officials pull the file from his hand and say, you're not allowed to look at that. We don't want to open that up again. Okay, so here's a place absolutely amazing in Alaska. Energy vortexes like the Bermuda Triangle. 33,000 miles of coast, 3 million lakes, 16,000 people have disappeared in the last 30 years there. We have a site of a sphinx up there. The remains of giants have been found. Remember that 23.5 degrees? Now I'm going to give you guys a little prediction today what my friends are saying in the archaeology and anthropology field. The stuff that you're going to find in the Arctic Circle, or that is already found there, and in Antarctica is going to blow your mind in the next 10 years. It's going to be stuff that's so out of this world crazy. But anyhow, in Alaska, there's a lot there that people don't even know what they're looking at, even outside of the Muir Glacier. So we're almost finished, I swear. We got like maybe 3 slides tops. Okay, this quote. Our earth is degenerate in these latter days. There are signs that the world is speedily coming to an end. Bribery and corruption are common. Children no longer obey their parents. Every man wants to write a book. And the end of the world is evidently approaching. Does anybody know who wrote this or when it's from? A Syrian tablet from 2800 BCE. Not much has changed, I guess. Yes. And that's what I want to paint the picture of today. All this information is very interesting. It sounds cool, but it has a greater picture to it. Each and every single one of you are the architects of the new paradigm, to use Jordan Peele's phrase. You know, if we want to be out there in space, we want to explore space, we have to really prove that we're worthy of it. We have to take care of each other first. We have to be the great caretakers of our Earth. We have a great future ahead of us. You know, our destiny is in the stars. All kinds of fantastic technology awaits you. The ability in the future by 2030 to even look as food as optional. You're going to have all sorts of incredible ways of experiencing things that you never thought was possible. And there is a peaceful future ahead, if you can imagine it. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and have a great night.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.